3 days later, when the cul-de-sac had calmed down after Poppy moved in next door, Emily arrived with a large white van filled with cardboard boxes. Each individual box was labeled with either Lauren or Lucy and was filled with clothes, jewelry, and shoes. Lauren's boxes were placed in Haley's room, which had become my room again since Lucy was now living in the spare room that Suzanne had originally prepared for me. Other boxes were not labeled and contained dozens and dozens of family photo albums and framed pictures. Lucy had used the photos to try and make me remember Lauren's past, and again I had to lie and occasionally say yes, I remember that, but for most of the pictures I just shook my head. I really couldn't think of any other answers to Lucy's questions, as my mind was busy thinking about the real Lauren. I felt guilty for stepping into her life, as if I had used her to become part of this loving family that I never had. I couldn't think about the real Lauren for very long, since I would hate myself whenever I did. It was better if I just forgot about the real Lauren and just enjoyed being part of a loving family. Emily stayed for a few hours, examining the house and asking Suzanne questions about her lifestyle and all that. When she was done, she gathered all of us around the kitchen table. She gave Suzanne a couple of forms to fill out and sign, and then once they were done, Suzanne was officially our legal guardian. Since Suzanne was now in charge of our lives, she was able to fill out applications to All Hallows for Lucy and myself, and then sent them off in the post. In the next week, All Hallows would be doing interviews and registration of new students, preparing them for the beginning of the school year in September. Suzanne, Lucy, and myself would be going to the school during that week, along with Poppy and her parents and about 200 Year 7s to compete for spots in the school. Kirsty told me that the process of joining All Hallows was a long and vigorous process and we could expect to be there the whole day, unless we were rejected. The day would start with scheduled interviews, which then be followed by about an hour of waiting to see if we had been accepted or not. Those that were rejected would be allowed to leave, and would get the rejection letter in the post. However, those students that were accepted would go through a registration process that included getting photos taken and being measured for their school uniform. The new students would have to wear their new uniforms for the rest of the day to get used to them, as they are taken on a tour around the school to see all the classrooms and get introduced to some of the teachers. The day would then end for the accepted students with an assembly in the main hall, where the head teacher Mrs. Dunn would give a speech. On the night before our day at All Hallows, I hoped that we would be among the rejected students going home after an hour. It sounded incredibly strict. So now, 2 going on 3 weeks since I got myself stuck in this situation, I find myself getting dressed by my fake sister in the early morning of Monday. Monday was the first of several registration days at All Hallows, and our interviews had been scheduled for 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. Why do we have to get up so early? I asked Lucy after seeing it was only 7 a.m. on the alarm clock. Because I want us both to be ready ahead of time. This is a new start for both of us and it has to go well, Lucy said as she pulled a plain white vest over my head, carefully avoiding it snagging on my training bra. In the boxes that Emily had delivered, there were a dozen pink training bras that were filled with a little extra stuffing, much more than the ones that I was already used to. The training bras I had used before were hardly noticeable beneath cloth, but these pink ones that officially belonged to me seemed to poke out a tiny bit more, and made it look like I was growing breasts. When is my little sister going to start growing, huh? Lucy said as she playfully poked the small mounds on my chest. I don't know. When? I asked, since I wasn't that familiar with girls' bodies. I guess you must be one of those late bloomers, Lucy said, shrugging. Though I could have sworn your little boobs were growing the last time I saw you, before I went to France. I smirked, instead of giving her a nervous look like my body was telling me to. I hope she wasn't onto something when she discovered I wasn't growing any boobs. They must have gone back inside me, I said nervously. I bet they'll be back in no time, Lucy said confidently as she knelt in front of me. Step into this. Lucy stretched open a pale red pleated skirt and held in front of me on the floor. "Do I have to wear this?" I asked. "Yes. Everything else is creased or in the wash because it wasn't properly folded. This is all you have for today, Lauren," Lucy said sternly. I crossed my arms and pouted as I stepped into the skirt, then shivered as Lucy pulled it up my clean-shaven legs and adjusted the black sash around my waist so it fit snugly. "You used to love this skirt before, you know," Lucy said. I really hoped Lucy was joking when she said that. If the real Lauren loved frilly skirts like these, she would probably love to wear some of the princess dresses that Haley owned. Since I'm now Lauren, Lucy is going to expect me to wear stuff like that in the future. If only the real Lauren was a tomboy. Lucy left me soon after she had placed a denim jacket over my shoulders, and told me to brush my hair until she came back since it really needs a good brushing. Suzanne had toned down her attempts at mothering me ever since Lucy had joined the household, since Lucy had apparently been quite annoyed by the way that I was thinking of Suzanne as my mother, or at least my fake mother. It all meant that Suzanne was no longer constantly around me, tucking me in at night, standing outside the door when I'm in the bath, and no longer insisting that she brush my hair. Lucy had brushed my hair several times since we had been reunited, but on most occasions now she leaves me to brush my own hair, which is something I don't normally do. I had learned that a simple and quick brushing wasn't good enough, and that for the rest of my life, or for as long as I was pretending to be a girl, I would be sitting at a mirror for hours brushing every strand of hair over and over again. Lucy came back fully dressed and ready when I was still sitting in front of the vanity table, slowly and lazily brushing my hair. "You're still brushing your hair? Or are you just sitting there admiring your pretty face?" Lucy asked with a sarcastic smirk, as if I knew when I should have stopped brushing. "I'm almost done," I told her as she left to go downstairs. For my feet, Lucy had decided I would wear a pair of nude strappy sandals with a lily detail that went up from the toes. Lucy had painted each of my nails, fingers and toes in a matching light blue, in preparation for the sandals, since this would be the first time I've actually showed my feet in public when dressed as a girl. At least I wasn't wearing high heels, like Suzanne was wearing when we all got into the car at 8:30. Poppy and her parents had already left, even though her interview was at the same time as mine, 9 a.m. Poppy and I had talked about having our interviews at the same time and on the same day, thinking it would be great if we did everything at our new school together. We were both stunned when we found out that what we wished for was actually going to happen, and decided that, assuming we both got accepted, we would go with each other on the tour and try and make sure we got into all the same classes. Even if we had no say in deciding whose classes we were in, we hoped that spending lots of time together on the registration day would make it clear to the teachers that we were best friends. If they knew we were best friends, we thought that perhaps they would try and put us together for every lesson, or at least some of our lessons. We arrived at the school 5 minutes before my interview, and the first impression I had of the school was it's old-looking. I wasn't wrong. All Hallows Senior School, or at least the main central building of the school, was a Victorian-style building. The bricks were a century old, the windows were tall and arched like in a church, and the roofs were high and pointed, again like a church. Most of the building had been modernized, with staff and visitors' car parks in front of the school, and modern windows indoors had replaced any old wooden ones. Lots of other blocks of buildings, some 2 or 3 floors high, were built around the main building. Most of them followed the color scheme of blue and white, whilst others were made from the same crimson-colored brick of the main building. Suzanne, Lucy and myself parked the car and walked into the reception area where at least 20 people were gathered around the main receptionist's desk, waiting to be directed. They were all parents with their children, all there for their interviews in one of the many rooms that had been made available. We were all given tags that labeled us as visitors, and then directed into a long corridor where chairs had been placed along the walls, where people could sit as they waited for their interviews to start. We sat on chairs directly opposite the door where my interview was going to be, and finally we were able to relax. The inside of the school had a very modern, high-tech feel to it. There were flat-screen monitors on the walls that were playing a slideshow of students in the school, doing their work, posing for the camera, having fun and playing. It was strange to think I might be one of them come September. After waiting for what seemed like ages, Poppy and her parents came walking down the corridor and upon noticing us, decided to rush over and chat about how exciting everything was. I could tell that it was only the parents that were excited, whilst Poppy, Lucy and myself were all very quiet and nervous. "Hasn't your interview started yet?" Poppy asked me. "Nope, it was supposed to be at 9 but there isn't anybody in the room yet," I told her. "They're probably just running late," Lucy added. "I think so, some people haven't turned up for their interviews so everything is kind of confused," Poppy said. We all nodded slowly in agreement. Suddenly the door opposite us opened, and an aging man who was probably in his 50s poked his head into the corridor. "Mrs. Allingham and Lauren, is it?" he asked politely. "Yes, we're here," Suzanne blurted out, making us all jump. "Very good, if you could just come inside and we'll get started," the man said, and then opened the door wider for us to enter. Suzanne said her goodbyes to Poppy's parents, then placed her hand on my back and herded me away from Lucy and Poppy and towards the door. That was also the cue for Poppy to head to her interview, so she pulled me into a surprise hug and whispered, "Good luck," in my ear. Lucy seemed somewhat jealous after that, so she also pulled me into a hug and whispered, "You'll do great," before Suzanne practically pulled me through the door. We walked into a small office, the inside of which was filled with many small things. A small wooden desk sat beneath a small window at the end of the room, small cabinets surrounded the desk with some doors open and others closed. Two hard-looking wooden chairs sat in the corner of the room next to the door we had just entered through, and they were facing in the direction of the only object in the room that could be considered large, the old man's high-backed chair. "Please take a seat," the old man said as he closed the door behind us and pointed us in the direction of the two chairs. I could have sworn that I felt something brush my bum, even pat it, as the old man stepped around me and sat down in his chair, but that suspicion was quickly forgotten as soon as I sat down myself. The chairs that Suzanne and I had been directed to sit on were among many of the objects in the small room that were almost ancient compared to the high-tech and modern corridor just outside the door. It looked like the cushions had long been removed from these chairs and all that was left was the hard wooden seats, and the ornately decorated but still equally as hard wooden backs. I feared I might break a bone and bum as soon as I sat down. The chairs were so hard that it felt like I didn't have a bum at all, and it was just pure bone knocking against hardwood. I desperately hoped that interview wasn't going to take very long, since my bottom wouldn't last more than 20 minutes on that chair. "Let me introduce myself," the old man said quite happily. "My name is Mr. Cross, one of the assistants to the head teacher. I also teach religious education for the upper years. I understand that you are one of our special cases?" Mr. Cross asked. "Lauren has already completed year 7, Suzanne explained. "At the Highgate School in London, is that correct, Lauren?" Mr. Cross asked. "Yes," I stuttered out nervously. "Did you enjoy your time there?" Mr. Cross asked and gave me a comforting smile. "I don't remember much about my time there," I said, being honest for once. "Well, I'm certain that attending such a school as Highgate is going to make you one of the more likely applicants to be attending All Hallows in September," Mr. Cross said. After the short introduction questions, Suzanne was made to explain my special situation. She explained how I didn't have any parents, and that she was my legal guardian. She even tried to get Mr. Cross to pity me by talking in detail about the car crash that I was in, or the crash that the real Lauren was in. Suzanne seemed to know so much more about what happened in the car crash than I did, and it was almost as if Suzanne was actually in the car crash and not me. The interview passed by quickly after that, with Mr. Cross explaining the details of the school and what the rest of the day would bring. The fact that Suzanne already had one daughter in school was apparently something that made me more likely to get, because they rarely reject someone with siblings already in the school. Unofficial siblings as well, I guess. When the interview was finished, it had only been 25 minutes, meaning that as soon as we left Mr. Cross' small office, Suzanne had to rush Lucy over to her own interview. Normally Suzanne wouldn't so easily abandon me like that, but since I wasn't allowed to sit in on Lucy's interview, she left me in the capable hands of Poppy and her parents. "How did your interview go?" I asked Poppy as we were shepherded through a crowd of children and adults by her parents. "She talked to my mom and dad a lot and only asked me a few questions," Poppy said, sounding irritated. "It was the same with me. Mr. Cross and my mom had a lot to say to each other, but he only asked me about my last school and what kind of girl I am," I said. It was quite hard figuring out what kind of girl I was, since I'd only been one for a couple of weeks. Suzanne had answered that question for me by saying I was a sweet, innocent, caring, intelligent and well-mannered girl, and one who was much more mature than my age suggested. Mr. Cross seemed mightily impressed by what kind of girl I was. "What kind of girl are you?" Poppy asked with a sly grin. "Apparently I'm a sweet and caring one with good manners," I smirked at her. We moved with a large crowd of 11-year-olds and their parents, and were herded into a large hall filled with hundreds of chairs all facing the stage. Long tables were arranged around the hall, filled with refreshments, leaflets and the occasional example of students' work. A large gathering of adults and students had already filled the hall, and groups were being picked out by teachers and assigned seats. The hundreds of chairs facing the stage were split down the middle, and I soon realized that they weren't trying to quickly sit everyone down, but they were specifically placing different groups on one of the two sides of the hall. Pretty soon Poppy and her parents were picked out by a tall, freckle-faced boy with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He was wearing a black blazer and trousers, with a white shirt and a black tie. The only other colors that could be found on him were 3 blue and yellow stripes that ran diagonally at the top of his tie, a metal yellow badge on his lapel that said prefect, and his scruffy red hair. "Mr. and Mrs. Jones?" he asked, his attention focused fully on Poppy's parents. "That's us, Mr. Jones," Poppy's dad said. "You have been seated on the right side of the hall, so if you could follow me to your seats," the prefect said, sounding very posh and formal. "What about Lauren here?" Megan, Poppy's mom, asked and gave me a concerned look. The prefect gave me a ponderous look and checked his clipboard. "Lauren who?" he asked. "Look for Allingham," Megan said confidently. The prefect scanned through whatever was on the clipboard. "Allingham/Dawson?" he asked. Poppy and her parents all had confused looks on their faces. "Oh crap," I thought to myself, "they still think I'm Suzanne's daughter." "Yes, that's me," I blurted out. Poppy and her mother looked at me suspiciously, her father less so. "She and her sister are also on the right of the hall, so she can sit with you. I'll keep 2 seats empty for when they arrive," the red-haired prefect declared and then showed us to our seats. "What did he mean Allingham/Dawson?" Poppy whispered in my ear as we sat down. It's a long story," I stammered. "Well, it looks like we're going to have to sit through a long boring speech, so we have time," Poppy said, growing more and more curious. "Well, let's just say me and Kirsty aren't that closely related," I said, just as Lucy and Suzanne were being directed towards their seats next to me. Poppy looked at me with equal amounts of confusion and suspicion, but as it turned out I didn't get any more time to explain. A tall skinny old woman, in her late 50s at least with long white hair bound tightly at the back of her head, stood up on the stage and addressed everyone through a microphone. I imagined that she was the head teacher Mrs. Dunn, who Kirsty had told me so much about. When she began talking, it sounded like she was beginning a long speech, but she was done in less than a minute. "On behalf of all the staff at All Hallows, I would like to thank you for attending today. Now I would be most grateful if the left side of the hall would begin leaving whilst the right side waits, just to avoid confusion and any possible injuries when leaving through the main gate. Thank you. We were all quite surprised and disappointed when we learned that there wasn't going to be any more than the interviews taking place, and when the whole left side of the hall had been cleared, everyone on the right side stood up and started moving to the exits. However, everyone stopped in their tracks when they heard the frantic but quiet words of the Mrs. Dunn, whose voice was quickly made louder when one of the teachers handed her back the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we didn't explain, but we were just splitting up those who had been rejected from those that were accepted. If you would please follow the prefects and teachers, who will direct you towards the beginning of the registration process. Lucy leaned down and placed her hand on my shoulder, as we were once again being directed this way and that by teachers and prefects. I guess we've been accepted then, she whispered in my ear with a wide smile on her face. Suzanne and Poppy's parents walked behind us, whilst Lucy positioned herself on my right with her arm around my shoulders and Poppy walked on my left, still giving me the occasional suspicious look. We were directed down dozens of corridors, and it felt like we were heading towards the front of the school, to where all the offices and receptionists were. We were heading towards a set of double doors when Poppy's parents and Suzanne were asked to abandon us and head into a nearby waiting room. When we passed through the double doors, the only people in the crowd were the New Year 7s, a couple of taller children who must have been some of the other special cases like Lucy, Poppy and myself. The lack of adults in the crowd somehow changed how the teachers and prefects were treating us. It felt like we were being herded into a pen like cattle. The teachers and prefects were organizing us into two lines. A 30-something woman with platinum blonde hair was shouting boys on the left, girls on the right. The crowd was starting to separate into these two neat lines, like a cell splitting in two. I don't know what it was, some sort of instinct or a voice in my head, but something made me turn to the left and start heading towards the male queue. Lucy spared me any embarrassment, because her arm was still around my shoulders. Upon noticing I was going left, she quickly turned me towards the right before anyone could really notice. "Did you forget your left and right, Lauren?" Lucy giggled behind me. So now I found myself standing in a slow-moving single-file queue of preteen girls. Some were wearing formal dresses that their mothers obviously made them wear to impress in the interview, but some girls were wearing casual clothes like me and they still got accepted. I noticed a few of the boys in the queue next to us were gazing at us, open-mouthed and in awe. I think most of them were looking at Lucy because she was probably the tallest girl in the queue, but also the most attractive compared to all the younger flat-chested girls around us. The unsettling thing was that some of the boys were also staring at me, making me feel more nervous than flattered. Poppy was standing in front of me in the queue and was also getting a lot of looks, but didn't seem to notice them and played it cool. I guess the three of us were just more mature looking than the girls around us, and thus we were more attractive to the boys. I never thought of myself as being attractive when I was still a boy, but now people were finding me attractive as a girl and all that was different was my hair and clothes. The boys' queue ended at another set of double doors, whilst the girls' queue continued for a few more meters. The room beyond the double doors that the boys were taking turns in going through was completely pitch black. Whenever the doors opened and a boy went in, there was a flash of green light and then darkness. Several minutes after the green flash, a tall and muscular man wearing a blue tracksuit poked his head out the door and said next. It was the same when we were coming towards the end of the girls' queue, a set of double doors and a pitch-black room behind them. This time it was a flash of pale pink light followed by darkness, and a 20-something woman with her black hair and falling down in ringlets and wearing sleek reading glasses and a business suit was the one saying next. I tapped Poppy on her shoulder and whispered, "This school has a creepy way of registering new students." "Don't worry," she said, suddenly dumping all those suspicious looks she was giving me before, and instead she gave me a comforting smile. "They had this at my old school. New technology, to make things faster and more efficient." Before Poppy could explain any further, she was being shown into the pitch-black room and disappeared as she waved back at me. A few minutes later, the flash of pink light came and once again the room was in total darkness. I waited for a few more minutes, with Lucy standing behind me and gently soothing my nerves with comforting words and shoulder squeezes. She had succeeded in calming me down, but all her work was worthless as soon as the double doors opened and the woman said next. I stood frozen still for a moment. The woman waited in the doorway looking impatient, but it was Lucy who gently nudged me forward and shouted good luck as the double doors closed behind me. When I walked into the pitch-black room, the woman introduced herself as Ms. Darcy and directed me around a thin wall that had been erected just in front of the door to block anyone from seeing into the room. Behind the thin wall, the room was dimly from the roof and the rest of the illumination came from a small metal control panel with green LED screens, many buttons and one giant red switch. In the center of the room was a raised square platform with metallic columns on each of the corners, which reached from the floor to the roof. Each of the columns had multiple cameras and lights pointing into the center of the platform. Miss Darcy positioned herself in front of the control panel and said, "Please stand on the platform and then we'll get you measured and dressed with a perfectly fitted school uniform." I took a few nervous steps towards the center before Miss Darcy gave me an irritated look that scared me enough to almost run the last few steps before I was standing on the raised platform. As soon as I was standing still, thick black walls began to slowly rise around platform. Miss Darcy spoke as if she used her nose instead of her mouth, which sounded even creepier when I couldn't see where she was. "For the equipment to work properly, I need you to strip down to your underwear." "Don't worry, I'm raising the privacy walls now," Ms. Darcy said, sounding bored as if she had been doing the same thing all day. The black walls around me slowly raised themselves higher than me and stopped just below the roof. I took that as the sign to start taking my clothes off and quickly tugged my skirt down my legs and dropped it on the floor, and did the same with my denim jacket, vest and sandals until all I was wearing was my pink training bra and a pair of lacy pink girls' briefs. The machine must have noticed that I was undressed and suddenly sprang to life. Green, red and blue lights were flashing on each of the columns around me. Above me, near the roof, a thin ray of pink light shot out from each of the columns and joined in the center. The rays expanded and focused for a few seconds, and then started to move downwards towards me. "So that's what the pink light was," I muttered. The pink rays moved down my body, providing the only light in an otherwise pitch-black room. I felt no pain when they passed over me, and any sci-fi fear I had of being destroyed by lasers had vanished after that. The pink rays went down my smooth and shiny legs and then disappeared when they reached the floor. The machine started whirring and buzzing, as if it was going to start the next stage, whatever that was, but suddenly all the sounds stopped and a dozen bright red lights were shining out from the columns around me. I heard the sound of a buzzer, the kind that the game show host uses when a contestant gets a question wrong, and then the black privacy walls around began to lower to the ground and Ms. Darcy came back into view. Now standing almost completely naked, I quickly and desperately covered my crotch with my hands, but Ms. Darcy wasn't looking at me suspiciously at all, she just had a puzzled look on her face. "Don't worry, dear, it's just us girls in here," she said, looking me up and down with a smile. "What happened?" I asked. "Nothing to worry about," she said. "Just a small error." "What error? Did I do something wrong?" I stammered out. No, of course not, dear. This machine has just been overworked, that's all. It's got itself confused and thinks you're a boy," she grinned at me. I gave her a nervous smile back, knowing that the machine was actually correct. "I know, right? Can't trust machines to do simple things." "I guess we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way," Ms. Darcy said in a surprisingly excited voice. "The old-fashioned way?" I asked. "Meaning I'll measure you myself and help you get dressed." Now, arms up, dear, we only have a few minutes, Ms. Darcy said as she pulled a tape measure from her pocket, wrapped it around my waist and then muttered some numbers to herself. I raised my arms and stood still whilst Ms. Darcy proceeded to measure around my legs, arms, shoulders and even my feet. When she was finally done, she wrote everything down on a small notepad and wandered off to a dark corner of the room to collect clothes. You're bigger than most of the girls I've seen today, Ms. Darcy said as she walked back towards the central platform, carrying a pile of plastic-wrapped clothes. I gave her a confused look, since I didn't exactly know what she meant. Oh no, dear, I'm not saying you're fat, you're actually quite slim. I'm just saying you're taller than some of the other girls, Ms. Darcy said hurriedly, trying to apologize for a non-existing insult. I'm a year 8 whilst nearly everyone else is a year 7, I said as Ms. Darcy stepped behind me holding a white short-sleeve blouse with a collar. I thought so, you looked a bit too mature to be with those girls, Ms. Darcy said as she slid my arms into the sleeves of the blouse. Button that up for me, dear, and I'll do the rest. I fiddled with the buttons on the blouse as Ms. Darcy knelt down in front of me, with a black pleated skirt in her hands. I stepped into the skirt just as I had done in the morning when Lucy was getting me dressed. There was actually a year 8 girl who came in just before you. Black-haired girl that stood in front of you in the queue. Ms. Darcy slid the black skirt up my legs and tucked the blouse underneath. Almost done, she muttered to herself. She's Poppy, my friend. She's also my new neighbor, I told her as she pulled a black tie from its packet. Do you know how to do this? She held the tie up to me and waited for an answer, and I shook my head at her since I had absolutely no idea. Friend and neighbor, huh? I suppose you'll be best friends by the time you start school in September, Ms. Darcy said as she leaned closer, her lavender perfume burning in my nose, and finished up the last buttons that I had left, buttoning me up to the neck. I don't know, maybe, I said, since I wasn't really sure if Poppy could become as close a friend as Kirsty was. Maybe? It's almost a certainty, dear. 2 pretty girls such as you and Poppy, living so close together, going to school together, sitting in class together, going home together. Future BFFs, I think, Ms. Darcy said confidently as she draped the tie around my neck and began flipping the ends this way and that, up, down and around. She gave it one final tug and it tightened around my buttoned-up neck. Future BFFs and future school royalty, I bet, Ms. Darcy smirked as she began unwrapping another package. School royalty? I asked, now even more confused. You're Kirsty Allingham's little sister, aren't you, Lauren? Ms. Darcy asked, but it sounded like she already knew the answer. How did you know? I asked. Poppy told me about her nervous best friend just outside the doors. I recognized your surname. Ms. Darcy pulled a girl's cut black blazer from its plastic package and stepped behind me. Well, I may not think of Poppy and me as best friends, but apparently she does. Your sister is the most popular girl in her year, surrounded by her close girlfriends and boys trying to catch her attention. Being her little sister is going to get you and Poppy quite high on the popularity ladder, I can assure you of that. That was certainly a side of Kirsty that I'd never seen before, the school queen. Ms. Darcy slid my arms into the sleeves of the blazer, and then instructed me to do the 2 buttons up at the waist. Though I hear it's not as simple as that. Ms. Darcy said ominously. Simple as what? I asked. I'm not one of those gossipy little girls outside, I actually work here, you know. I've seen your file, Miss Dawson, she smirked at me. Kirsty is still my best friend, her mom is my legal guardian, I said. Well, having her as a best friend will still get you far in the school, Ms. Darcy said as she adjusted the blazer for a few moments before unwrapping another package. Does anyone else know? I asked. Only the staff. To avoid ridicule from other students, you and your sister Lucy will be referred to as Allinghams just like Kirsty, Ms. Darcy said. She pulled 2 long white socks from the package and pulled them up to my ankles. "Pull these up and I'll go get your shoes," Ms. Darcy instructed before walking off into the darkness again. I grabbed one of the white socks gathered up at my ankles and began pulling, thinking that they would end at the bottom of my shins, but they just kept going. I eventually pulled both socks up to below my knees, just like the little girls used to do at my old school. Ms. Darcy came back carrying a couple of bags, and then slipped my sandals back onto my feet, which felt less snug now that I was wearing thick socks. She listed everything that came in the bags. For my school uniform, 4 more pleated and plain black skirts, 2 pairs of woven black trousers, 2 more pairs of white knee-high socks, 3 pairs of black knee-high socks, 2 school ties, 4 more plain white blouses, 2 black V-neck jump for the winter and for my P. kit, 3 sky blue polo shirts, 3 plain navy shorts, 4 pairs of white ankle socks. After listing everything, Ms. Darcy declared that I was ready and helped me carry all of the bags, as well as my own clothes, out the other end of the room. She grinned at me as she said, "See you in September, future Miss Popular," and closed the doors once I had left. I groaned aloud, thinking I just wanted to get through school quickly, not be constantly harassed by people asking me about Kirsty. I stepped into a room filled with hundreds of preteens, boys and girls, all wearing the same uniform as me, all carrying a ton of bags or making their parents carry them. Poppy and her parents were sitting nearby with Suzanne, along with a ton of bags filled with mostly black clothes. Everyone looked the same, except for their shoes. Shoes were the only things that weren't changed, because apparently it wasn't needed for what came next in the registration process. Lucy came through the doors and joined us a couple of minutes later, dressed in exactly the same uniform as everyone else, except she was apparently wearing nude tights instead of socks. She said, "It's something you'll be doing in the upper years, sis, when you start to think those socks are too childish." When everyone was finished being dressed, we were once again directed down more corridors and split into girls and boys. This time I didn't make the mistake of joining the boys' queue, however. We were led into a small classroom where a blue backdrop had been hung up, and a photographer was taking photos of the students. I had to force a smile as I stood in front of that backdrop and the man took a picture of my face, which would later be used on my student ID. Lucy and Poppy suffered the same humiliation of having to say cheesecake or sausages before our whole group could continue, but we were thankful to find out that the registration process was over. Next we were led on a tour of the school by one of the student volunteers from year 11. She took us through the high-tech-looking science department, with its long classrooms and specially fitted desks that came with sinks and Bunsen burners. The English block and each of its classrooms, the maths department, the technology buildings, the language department and all the other subject areas which each occupied an area of the school. The drama department seemed to look the most interesting, mostly because there were no desks inside. It was just a flat open space with hooks on the walls for blazers and bags, a couple of computers for editing, microphones for singing and storytelling. It generally seemed like a fun place to spend an hour or so. We were introduced to some of the teachers too. The old but incredibly wise Mr. Wells, the young but strict Ms. Azencott, which our volunteer had nicknamed Apricot, the middle-aged and quiet Mrs. Cormett, the jolly and caring Mrs. Andrews, even the head teacher's daughter was a teacher, the kind Ms. Dunn. The year 7s in our group were then led off to meet their form tutors and see their form rooms. The form tutors were the teachers that basically looked after you in the morning and afternoon, taking care of registration and representing students whenever they were in trouble. I guess the form tutor was like a student lawyer, in a way. The form rooms were where you would start your day every day, where morning and afternoon registration would take place. To me, a form room was like your form's base, or headquarters. But Poppy, Lucy and myself wouldn't get to experience all that until September, when we would just be added into an existing form group in our own year groups. After the tour around the school, we were finally allowed to go home, knowing that we would learn who our form tutors were going to be just a few days before the start of term. After feeling like Poppy suddenly hated me when I told her I wasn't really in Allingham, it was a nice surprise when she hugged me and said good night when both of us had returned to cul-de-sac. It was approaching 4 p.m. when we got back, so Suzanne started getting dinner ready as soon as got inside the house. Lucy and I carried our new uniforms up the stairs and into our separate rooms. Lucy warned me not get my uniform dirty and asked that I get changed before dinner, which I did. Or at least I almost did. When I was down to my underwear and training bra, I heard a knocking on my bedroom door and Kirsty's voice. "Hey, Lauren? Can I talk to you for a bit?" she asked, already opening the door. I stood in the middle of the room, watching her as she entered wearing a blue sleeveless dress that reached to just above her knees. She looked different, healthier, glowing with beauty, maybe even taller. I found myself staring at her boobs for several moments. They also seemed different. Were they bigger? No. They were rounder, weren't they? I struggled to figure how they were different, but I knew it was still Kirsty, just an even more beautiful Kirsty. "Hey! Stop staring!" Kirsty snapped at me. "Sorry. You look different," I said, still struggling to describe how she was different. "Look, a couple of days ago I found this new store in town and bought a few things. I haven't really got the chance to wear any of it until now, but when I put this on it felt perfect, as if my body had been molded to fit it." "I've never felt so good about how I look," Kirsty said. She never sounded happier than she did at that moment. I looked her up and down and agreed with everything she said and more, but was quickly filled with suspicion as I noticed that she had her hands behind her back. "Well, you look really pretty, but what do I have to do with it?" I asked her. "I bought this for me, but it should fit you perfectly. Can you wear it? Please?" Kirsty asked just as her hands swung around to her front, revealing what she wanted me to wear. It was a blue and white polka dot dress, with a corsage detail on the strap and a frill just below the waist. On the label it read "Free Spirit Asymmetrical Frill Dress." "Do I have to?" I asked, looking at the dress that Kirsty was slowly walking towards me with. "I want to decide what I wear from now on. Please wear it? Just for a few minutes to see what it does. Maybe it might do something different because you're a boy. Please?" Kirsty asked again. "If I wear that, you have to promise to never make me wear anything again," I declared. "I promise, now arms up," Kirsty said, and was on me in less than a second. I lifted my arms up and she lifted the dress over my head, then slowly pulled it down over my body, a feeling I was getting used to. I was not, however, used to a tingling feeling along my arms as the dress fell down them, or a heightened sensitivity in my chest as the dress passed over my nipples. Other than these strange new feelings, my body didn't feel any more different than it was before putting on the dress, so I was relieved to think that I could now stop worrying about Kirsty or Suzanne trying to dress me up. "There, I put it on and I don't feel any different," I said. Kirsty was standing on the spot in silence, staring at me as if something amazing had happened. I couldn't figure out what she was staring at, but all I could say was "what?" before we heard the front door bell ring from downstairs. As I waited for Kirsty to say something, or at least just look at something other than my chest, I heard the sound of Suzanne's slippers pit-patting down the corridor towards the front door. I heard the door open, and then there was silence. I waited for a few moments before stepping towards the door of my bedroom, fear growing in my stomach as I wondered what was going on just down the stairs. Kirsty followed me out the door and we stood at the top of the stairs, looking down towards the front door. Because of the angle, all we could see was Suzanne standing at the door, staring at someone or something obscured by one of the indoor walls. "Lauren!" Suzanne shouted, her head turned slightly towards the stairs but her attention remained on whoever was at the door. I imagined that the only reason Suzanne would call me to the door would be that Poppy had come over. Maybe Poppy wanted to talk about the Allingham/Dawson thing from earlier in the day, but even if it was just her, I didn't understand why everything seemed so suspicious. I sprang into action as soon as Suzanne called, and was almost sprinting down the stairs at one point in my short journey to the door. The dress that Kirsty had put me in was blowing this way and that as I ran down the stairs. It felt like a parachute, or even a sail that was trying to blow me back up the stairs. The fear of being blown over was pretty much cancelled out by a strange new feeling between my legs, or rather a feeling that wasn't there anymore. Normally I would feel my boy parts beneath my trousers if I was moving at any speed, but this time as I rushed down the stairs, I didn't feel them at all. However, before I could start fearing the worst, I was greeted by another shock as I saw who was standing in the doorway. Suzanne gave me a confused look, but I didn't care much about where she was looking. I was more focused on the 30-something woman and the small girl standing next to her on the welcome mat outside of the house. I instantly recognized the small girl to be the same girl from the missing persons picture that Mrs. Logan had shown me at the council offices. I think she had more of a resemblance to the picture than I did, or maybe that was just because she was an actual girl and I wasn't. The woman standing next to her didn't remind me of anyone, but she had her arm around the girl next to her in a protective manner, just like Lucy was protecting me before. They must be related, I thought, but whoever the woman was, I knew the small girl beside her was the real Lauren Dawson. Lucy walked through the lounge and stood in the corridor, her eyes focused on Suzanne. She had apparently not yet noticed the people in the door. "The potatoes are almost ready, Suzanne, Lucy trailed off as her wandering eyes finally saw the two people standing in the doorway. Lucy's eyes suddenly became filled with tears, and a quick look at the two in the doorway told me that they were on the verge of crying as well. "Mom?" Lucy asked, struggling to get her words out, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at the woman standing in the door. The mother of Lucy and Lauren Dawson. We had been traveling for weeks, my husband Marcus, my daughter Lauren and myself, in an old camper van. My eldest daughter Lucy had gone abroad on a school trip in France, only knowing that the rest of us would be heading down to Devon whilst she was away. That trip to Devon was postponed as soon as we got a strange letter in the post, which provided the information that Marcus and I had been searching for all these years. The letter was sent anonymously and no location was given, but it provided us with a clue as to where we might find something, or rather someone that was taken from us almost 12 years ago. I don't know what to feel whenever I think about that cold wintry night in early February 1993. I was 22 and had just given birth to my daughter Lauren, one of the happiest days in my life along with the birth of my first daughter and of course, my wedding day. But what many people do not know is that I gave birth to 2 children that night. There were complications throughout the pregnancy. I spent the full 9 months waddling around with a huge belly, having doctors say that I was healthy and the 2 babies growing inside me were doing fine. The confusion began when the doctors said they couldn't figure out the babies' genders, which was only a small issue since we planned on finding out their genders when they were born. Of course, when they were born, that was when the real complications began. After a couple of hours in labor, the doctors decided they couldn't perform a natural birth. I was rushed into an operating theater and given a regional anesthesia, whilst the doctors performed an emergency C-section. As soon as they were born, the 2 babies were taken away to intensive care, without anyone shouting "it's a girl" or "it's a boy," like they had when Lucy was born. It was almost 2 days before we were able to see the newborns, even though the doctors had decided there was nothing wrong with them. The only thing that was wrong was that one of them was missing. We searched the hospital, but there was no sign of the second child. Everywhere we looked, we could not find a second baby that had come from the operating theater that we were in. Only a few people had seen 2 wrapped-up newborns leave the theater, but none of them knew where the second had gone after that. We left the hospital with only 1 newborn, our daughter Lauren, and we were still intent on finding the missing one. We didn't even know the sex of the baby, since only a handful of nurses and doctors had seen the baby naked. Some claimed it was a boy, whilst others claimed it was a girl. Nobody was sure, but Marcus and I decided it was more important to find the baby first and discover the gender later. We spent 6 months searching, following up leads, asking questions around the hospital, and yet we still hadn't found anything. Eventually, the pressure of looking after our 2 daughters and searching for our missing 3rd child caught up to us, and we decided to stop looking and focus on Lucy and Lauren. Although we never stopped looking completely, we did decide to cover up the story of our missing child. Our daughters were too young to remember, so we didn't tell them either. On a couple of occasions, Marcus and I had thought about forgetting our missing child completely. Each time we thought about it, we argued, but eventually decided not to forget about him or her and hope that he or she is somewhere in the world, safe and happy. Now, back in the present. I am 34, Marcus is 37, Lucy is 15 and Lauren is 12. We have lived happily as a family in London for 10 years after moving there from Plymouth because of Marcus's job. Only a handful of people, including our parents, Marcus's brother and my 2 sisters, know about our missing child, the subject of which has become a deep dark secret. However, all that changed when we received that strange letter in the post. The sender was anonymous, but Marcus and I knew it must have been the person or people who kidnapped our child because of the way they, openly admitted to kidnapping. "We are to blame for the disappearance of your child 12 years ago," the letter had said. The letter went on to say that an infertile couple, which decided that instead of adopting a child, they would kidnap one, had stolen our child. They posed as a doctor and a nurse and kidnapped a random newborn child from the hospital, which happened to be ours. The letter went on and on about how the couple were desperate to raise their own child, and had loved and cared for our child for several years until they gave up and decided that they couldn't do it anymore. They stopped caring about the child they had stolen, stopped loving it and grew to despise it. In fact, throughout the letter they never referred to the child as anything more than it, so we still didn't know the sex of our baby or its name. The letter finished by explaining why they had decided to contact us, and that apparently the child that they kidnapped and registered as their own had run away from them recently. The letter gave us an address of the house where we would find our child and finally be reunited after 12 years. We postponed our trip to Devon and packed our bags for a journey to Wales instead. The first step was to finally tell Lauren about her having another sibling, and how she wasn't the only one that was pulled out of me on her birthday. Her reaction to the news was quite surprising. She was actually excited. Lauren didn't even cry, but really, what was there to be sad about? We were finally going to have the 3 children that we brought into this world, and they would all be together at last. I had tried to phone Lucy before we left to tell her the news, but she was unreachable where she was in France with her school friends, so I decided I would phone later. I guess I could have left a letter at home for when Lucy got back, but really we all expected to be back home within a day and with a new addition to our family. That wasn't how things turned out, unfortunately. The address that the letter gave us had long been abandoned, but after some asking around we found out that the people that had lived there many years ago had moved to Scotland. We were given another address to look for and were back on the road within the hour, arriving at the new address by midnight. Again we were told that 2 adults and a child had lived there many years ago, but had long moved away. We were given another address that would take us to Ireland, and so decided we would sleep overnight at a hotel and continue our search in the morning. That was the pattern of our lives for the past few weeks, being sent across Britain and constantly being told to go somewhere else. We had been traveling for 3 weeks, visiting each house that our child's kidnappers had previously lived in. The kidnappers were constantly changing their names, only living in one place for a couple of months or less and making hardly any impact on the locals that lived nearby. The 3 weeks on the road had also been spent without a call from Lucy, whom we still hadn't heard from since she left for France. Every time we tried to phone her, she couldn't be reached, and if she had tried to phone us, the empty batteries in our cell phones wouldn't have helped. If only we had prepared better for this trip, and had known it was going to last 3 weeks longer than we originally thought. Our latest stop was a small suburban cul-de-sac in Hampshire, and we arrived just as it was beginning to get dark. We began our routine of knocking on every door in the neighborhood, asking about our child's kidnappers and where they might have moved to next. Lauren and Marcus picked one side of the cul-de-sac whilst I picked the other, and I started on the largest house in cul-de-sac. I walked up the small driveway, with a small front garden to my left but what was definitely the largest house in the cul-de-sac standing in front of me. I knocked on the door and after a few moments' wait, a small girl with long black hair tied back in a loose ponytail opened the door. She was wearing a very smart-looking black blazer on top of a white blouse with a black tie around her neck and a black pleated skirt around her waist. There was a blue and gold crest sewn onto the breast pocket of her blazer, which had a small pointed building and the words All Hallows written beneath, which instantly made me think it was a school uniform, which I thought most kids would hide away during the summer holidays. She was perhaps 12 or 13, roughly the same height as my Lauren, and a small voice in my head was asking, "Is she my missing child?" "Hello, dear. I just have a few questions about the house you're living in. Are your parents around?" I asked in my calm and friendly voice, which had quickly become my default voice after raising 2 daughters and meeting each new girlfriend that they brought home with them. "Sure. The girl flashed me a smile before yelling over her shoulder. "What is it, Poppy?" a woman about my age asked as she was coming down the stairs. "A lady at the door has some questions for you," Poppy said. "Who is it?" shouted a man's voice from behind a door in one of the downstairs rooms. "Don't worry, Harry, I'll handle it," said the woman as saw me in the doorway, smiled briefly and then turned her attention to her daughter. "Poppy, honey, I thought I told you to get changed out of your new uniform," the woman reminded her daughter as Poppy walked back up the stairs. "I know, Mum, I'm doing it now," Poppy said as she disappeared into what I guessed was her room upstairs. "Sorry about that, my daughter has so much buzzing around in her head these days," the woman said with a smirk. "I know what you mean, I have 2 daughters of my own." "Tough work," I grinned at her and she chuckled. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. No, I just have some questions about this house, about the people that used to live here," I said. "Well, we didn't really get a chance to meet them before we moved in. They left the house in a bit of a state, but it's nothing we can't fix up ourselves," she said confidently. "It sounds like they haven't fixed it up yet, that means they must have moved in recently," I thought to myself. "So you must have moved in recently?" I asked. "Yes, about a week or so ago. The last owners moved out maybe a week or 2 before we moved in," she said. I felt my heartbeat quicken, excitement growing inside of me, tears making their way towards my eyes. We were close. We were catching up on the 2 that had taken my child from me. "Miss? Is everything all right?" the woman asked, suddenly looking and sounding concerned for me. "Yes. Thank you so much, everything is just terrific, absolutely terrific," I said, hardly able to contain my excitement and started to step away from the door. "Any time," the woman said, looking quite confused as she slowly closed the door. I gave myself a few moments to regain my composure, still struggling to stop myself from feeling like a giddy little girl riding her first bike, or a schoolgirl going off to her prom. My next stop was another large house, perhaps the same size as the one I just visited. This house shared a garden fence with Poppy's house, and was nicely hidden at the end of the cul-de-sac. When I knocked on the door, an elderly couple that were most likely beyond a retirement age welcomed me. I asked about the people who used to live next door, in the house where Poppy now lived with her family. Although the elderly couple didn't know much about their neighbors, they knew that the previous owners of Poppy's house had lived there for the past 10 years and had moved out a few weeks ago. If they had lived there for 10 years, it would make sense. They had lived at all the other houses that we visited for a combined total of around 2 years, plus the 10 years they spent living here. I thought through the math over and over to make sure I was right, but I knew I was right, and I knew we had finally caught up to our child's kidnappers. If they lived there for 10 years, people must have seen if they had any children, I thought to myself. They had a son, a shy boy, perhaps 12 years old, long blonde hair, blue eyes, likes to hang around with the girls of the cul-de-sac, the elderly couple told me when I asked if they had seen any children. That was the best news I'd ever heard, and that moment ranked among one of the happiest moments of my life, finding out that my child was so close. I knew the boy they were talking about was mine. Blonde hair and blue eyes was the trend with Lucy and Lauren. They had their father's blue eyes and my natural blonde hair, which had eventually grown darker as I got older. Lucy's hair was now more of a honey blonde/light brown shade, but Lauren's hair was still pure golden blonde. I started to piece together the bits of information that we had slowly gathered over the last few weeks. We had visited somewhere around 20 different addresses, and each time we were certain that the kidnappers had lived there. They had lived and moved on to each of these addresses for a total of 2 years, with some people telling us that they had been seen with a small child. For the 2 years after they had kidnapped our baby, they moved around constantly until they finally relaxed and settled into this sleepy little cul-de-sac in Hampshire. They stayed in this cul-de-sac for 10 years, raising our child as their own. The neighbors all got a chance to meet the child, who had grown into a healthy boy, but had also appeared to spend most of his time outside. Whenever he was asked about the people he thought were his parents, he didn't like to reply. All of the neighbors seemed to think he was being treated poorly in his home, and so he spent almost every hour of the day playing with the children in the cul-de-sac. I was glad that my son had friends so close to where he lived, and that he spent so much time with them having fun, but the thought of these fake parents of his treating him poorly whenever he got home made my blood boil. He must have got tired of living with them and decided to run away. That would have happened only a few weeks ago, since Poppy's family seemed to be the only ones who didn't know about him, and they only moved in recently. He is nearby, my son is nearby. He wouldn't have gone far, he must have been hiding somewhere. His fake parents wouldn't have searched very long, they probably moved far away from here as soon as he went missing, I thought to myself. I never let idea of my son being dead enter my mind. I had to believe he was still alive. Marcus and Lauren rejoined me outside the final house in the cul-de-sac, and when I told them the news that they had mostly already learned from the other houses, we could all hardly contain our excitement. Oh, you know what, I think I might have dropped the keys to the camper van. I'll go find them whilst you do this one. Brownies. Marcus grinned at me as he patted down his jean pockets and heard a distinct lack of any jingling keys. Both Marcus and I were still quite young, in our opinion, and deeply in love with each other, which often led to us calling each other by pet names, especially when we were as excited as we were at that moment. Dad! Lauren moaned at him as he went off in search of the keys. Come on, Lori, you can ring the doorbell. I smiled down at Lauren and she gave me a childish grin like she always did when she was excited. I placed my hands under her armpits and lifted her up, which was now much harder since she was 12 instead of 2, but held her long enough for her to ring the doorbell. I put Lauren back down on her feet and placed a protective arm around her shoulders as we waited for the door to be answered. We could soon see a tall and curvy woman through the small glass windows in the door, and she slowly made her way towards us. As soon as she opened the door, we could hear the sound of bacon sizzling, eggs frying, plates and cutlery knocking together as they were laid down on a table. It was obvious that this family was just about to have dinner, so I decided I would make this visit as quick as possible. The woman was wearing white slippers, blue jeans and a white blouse with the sleeves rolled up. She looked to be in her 30s, perhaps the same age as me, and her long layered brown hair was tumbling around her shoulders. She gave us both a pleasant smile, but her eyes suddenly widened as all her attention turned to Lauren. Lauren, she asked after several seconds of silence. How do you know my daughter? I asked suspiciously. I could tell Lauren was nervous as she wrapped her arms around my waist. I pulled her closer and gently stroked her mop of golden blonde hair in an attempt to calm her. The woman took a few moments to reply, since she appeared even more surprised after I had said daughter. She turned her head slightly towards the stairs inside the house, but her eyes never left us. "Lauren," she shouted. Lauren's arms tightened around my waist. "This woman must be crazy," I muttered to myself and began to step away from the door. We heard the rushed footsteps of someone coming down the stairs and the rustling of a dress blowing in the wind. We paused to see who was coming, obviously someone else called Lauren because they were reacting to the woman's shout. It was a girl, wearing a blue and white polka dot frill dress that had run down the stairs and stepped into our view. Her eyes were a lively dark blue just like Lauren and Lucy, her long tousled hair was a glowing golden blonde just like Lauren. All the similarities were there to see, the celestial nose, the rosy complexion, the slim build. I was willing to bet that this girl and Lauren were almost exactly the same height and the same age. There were differences too, but only one. Lucy and Lauren both had heart-shaped faces like their father, but this girl had an oval-shaped face and a jaw narrower than her cheekbones, just like mine. That voice in my head returned once again and hopefully asked, "Is that my child? Is that her?" But it couldn't be her, could it? We were looking for a boy, weren't we? But this girl looked so similar to Lauren, so what if the neighbors were wrong? What if they thought the child living in that house was a girl all along, just wearing boys' clothes? I had heard of girls being raised as boys in some countries. You know, to avoid persecution or just because their parents wanted a boy. It was possible that had happened here my missing daughter. Perhaps she had run away and dressed as girl to hide from her kidnappers, and now she was standing in front of me. It must be possible, she's standing right there, it must be her, it must be, the voice in my head pleaded with me, but I remained cool and prevented myself from flinging my arms around the girl and taking her home. The girl stood in the corridor next to the woman, and her facial expression turned from confusion to a mix of terror and surprise. None of us said a word, everyone seemed to be in a shocked silence, but that changed when I heard a familiar voice. Lucy suddenly appeared in the corridor and looked at the brown-haired woman, without even noticing Lauren and myself standing in the doorway. "The potatoes are almost ready, Suzanne," Lucy trailed off as her eyes wandered and finally caught sight of us. What was she doing here, was my first thought. "Mom?" Lucy asked in a whispery voice, her eyes welling up. I was stunned, I didn't know what to say. Finding what could be my missing daughter had somewhat overshadowed finding my eldest daughter in the same house. I felt Lauren's arms around my waist loosen and she stepped forward, my arm around her shoulders falling away. "Lulu?" Lauren asked. Lucy's mouth broke into her familiar toothy smile, tears began streaming down her cheeks as she rushed past Suzanne and out the door towards us. I held out my arms openly for Lucy as she briefly ignored her sister and flung her arms around my neck. At 5'6", I was only a couple of inches taller than Lucy, who was 5'2", and she was able to rest her chin on my shoulder for a few seconds, before she looked down at Lauren. She skipped all of the traditional reunion lines such as "I missed you so much" or "I thought I'd never see you again" and examined Lauren closely. She unwrapped her arms from around my neck and turned to look at the two standing in the doorway. She gave the small golden-haired blonde girl a confused glance and did the same with Lauren. Lucy turned back to me and wiped the tears from her eyes. "Which one is the real Lauren?" she asked, quite confused. "The real Lauren?" I asked back, even more confused. "Ian, I have boobs." I shouted at Kirsty as she tried to calm me down. I had been sent up to Haley's room by Suzanne, and was being treated coldly by everyone except Kirsty and the dark blonde-haired woman that Lucy had called her mom. I was struggling to deal with my fake story being blown out of the water, but once Kirsty and I were alone in Haley's room, she had explained why she had such an amazed look on her face before and now gave me something else to deal with. When she was talking about her new blue dress feeling like it molded her body to fit perfectly, she wasn't imagining things. It was something in the material, a fancy technology that was designed to remove imperfections. Kirsty hadn't paid much attention to the technology and was only buying pretty clothes that were advertised as having magical effects on the body. She hardly remembered how the clothes were supposed to work, but what little she did remember was high-tech mumbo-jumbo that neither of us understood. "Calm down, Lauren. Just calm down," Kirsty said in an angry whispered voice. "My name isn't Lauren anymore. The real Lauren is downstairs and now everyone knows I'm a fake." I whispered back angrily. "I can't even prove that I'm a boy because of these stupid things on my chest." I looked down and groaned at the sight of the small mounds that had formed where my nipples once were. There was still a dull throbbing pain around my nipples, which had been the result of Kirsty giving them a rough prod to prove they were real. She was as surprised as I was when I instantly reacted with a girlish ow and jumped back. "Maybe if you take the dress off, you'll be a boy again?" Kirsty wondered. I didn't think of that before. I guess I was so blown away by having boobs that I forgot the dress was what had caused them to grow. I didn't bother coming up with a reply for Kirsty, and quickly raised my hands to the shoulder straps of the blue and white polka dot dress that she had pulled over my head. Pulling the dress off turned out to be much harder than putting it on, as there was no zip to pull down or buttons to unbutton. Kirsty came up behind as I struggled to pull on the shoulder straps without my arms getting in the way. She batted my hands away, raised my arms, and then expertly pulled the dress over my head. I felt my new boobs being lightly tugged upward along with the dress, and then fall back to their original perky positions inside my pink training bra. When the dress was eventually removed, I still felt the constricting feeling of the training bra, which I had expected, but the extra weight of the fleshy mounds on my chest was still there. "It didn't work," Kirsty said worriedly. "I know it didn't work. What are we going to do?" I asked frantically. "We'll go to the store and see if they can change you back. Meg's Prosthetic Fashions, on Waverly Road," Kirsty said. I looked around the room and saw my reflection in the large mirror on Haley's vanity table. What I saw was a 12-year-old girl wearing a pink bra and pink girl's briefs, with a slim body, golden blonde hair falling around her shoulders, small breasts sticking out of her chest, and a very, very flat-looking crotch. I slowly realized as I looked in the mirror that my boy parts probably weren't there anymore, and moved my hand to gently pat on top of the girl's briefs that wrapped themselves around my hips. I felt nothing, there was no bulge or lumps or anything. It was just flat skin. But when I pressed a little harder, I felt like I was poking inside my body, and immediately pulled my hand away, feeling disgusted with myself. I went weak at the knees upon finding out that my boy parts had been replaced by a hole between my legs, and almost collapsed if it wasn't for Kirsty catching me. Kirsty supported me as we walked to Haley's bed and sat down on the edge, me in my bra and panties whilst she was still wearing her magical blue dress. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders and pulled me close, since I must have looked like a nervous wreck, and I was. I had been living as a boy with a boy's body, and now suddenly some silly dress decided to turn me into a girl. It felt like a huge rock had been pulled from beneath my feet, which had been supporting me for 12 years. I imagined it in my head, this rock being pulled from beneath me. It was a mossy and crumbling rock, filled with anger and hate, loneliness and embarrassment. At the center of the rock were parents that didn't love me. I watched them shatter and disappear. Perhaps now I had landed on a new rock, fresh from the quarry, smooth and shiny. Before, I had stumbled and stepped on the real Lauren's life, and thought that was new life, but now, things felt different. Maybe this new body means my own new life, a refresh, and a chance to start again on a new rock. I felt a few warm tears streaming down my cheeks as the daydream ended. Kirsty was shaking me gently as if to wake me up. "Kirsty, Lauren. Can you come downstairs please?" we heard Suzanne shouted from down in the lounge. "I don't want to go down there, Kirsty," I said nervously. "But we have to go down there, they want to know what's going on," Kirsty said as she got up from the bed and pulled me up with her. "Can't we just stay up here?" I asked childishly. Look, now that you're not a boy anymore, Mom won't be as angry. Things will sort themselves out, I promise. Kirsty tried desperately to make me feel safe. We need to get you dressed, she said, and began opening and searching the clothes drawers in around Haley's room. Why don't I just wear the dress again? I asked and pointed at the blue and white dress that was hanging over the vanity table chair, ready to be worn. Kirsty had already gathered up an outfit for me to wear, consisting of denim shorts, a pink top and black leggings that had tiny little pink plastic gems stuck around the shins. I didn't think you'd want to wear it again after what it did to you, she said. Do you want to wear it again? She asked. I shook my head and didn't say a word. I didn't want to know what else that dress could do. Girls! Suzanne shouted again, and sounded as if she was much closer, perhaps halfway up the stairs. Quickly, quickly, put these on. Kirsty whispered frantically and handed me the denim shorts and pink top, then pushed me back down onto the bed and began sliding the leggings up my legs. I pulled the pink top over my head, struggling to get my arms through the sleeves because I was so nervous, my heart beating a million times a minute as we heard footsteps outside the door, which wasn't blocked this time. The top draped itself over and around the tiny boobs sprouting from my chest, and fell loosely around my waist. Kirsty pulled me back up from the bed and pulled the black leggings the rest of the way up my legs. I almost tripped and fell over as I rushed to step into the leg holes of the tiny denim shorts, and only had them up to my knees when Suzanne barged into the room, with her face bright red and imaginary steam bursting out of her ears. She gave us a wickedly suspicious look, as if she thought we were planning something, but for once this time we weren't planning or hiding anything. The last time she had barged into the room screaming, she was searching for a boy in the room. This time, as hard as it was to admit, there wasn't a boy anywhere. This isn't the time to be playing dress up, now get downstairs so we can sort this whole mess out, Suzanne said, clearly irritated. I pulled the denim shorts up my legs, and felt like they slotted into place when I raised them around my waist. Now there was nothing poking into the material, the shorts fit snugly against my skin and wrapped themselves around my slightly broader hips, another change that the dress had brought and I had only just noticed. I noticed my fake nails for the first time in a while as I buttoned the shorts up, still painted sky blue just like the toenails of my feet as they poked out from beneath the leggings. Painted nails and the girl's clothes seemed much less out of place, now that I was a girl, or at least now that I had a girl's body. They seemed to suit the body I was in, fit it perfectly instead of just being used to hide what was underneath. Kirsty pulled on my arm and followed me out the door whilst Suzanne followed behind us. Stop stalling, Kirsty whispered as we made our way down the stairs. The lack of anything moving between my legs was now more noticeable than ever after I had actually realized it was gone, but there was no time to mourn its loss. Marcus, so you thought we had gone missing and died? I asked Lucy just to clear things up. She had just finished explaining what had gone on since she got back from France, after Liz, and I had already finished explaining where we had been. Finally we were on the same page, or at least just a few pages from each other. What was I supposed to think? You hadn't left any messages and weren't answering your phone. I reported it to the police and told them you were heading down to Devon like you said, Lucy said, struggling to stop tears of joy from occasionally rolling down her cheeks. The skin around her eyes was burning red because she had kept wiping the tears away with her sleeve. We would have been able to phone you if your father had prepared for the trip better, Liz said and gave me an accusingly look that caused Lucy and Lauren to give me angry glares. Your mother was the one who decided not to leave a letter, she's as much to blame as I am. I grinned at Liz as she narrowed her eyes at me. So why did the police think we were in a car crash? Lauren asked innocently. The police must have rushed to link the car crash with us going missing. We should have expected some incompetent and hurried police work after the way they handled the investigation of the kidnapping 12 years ago, Liz said, a hint of police hatred in her voice. Lucy wrapped her arms around my bicep and clung to it tightly from her perch on top of the armrest of the couch. "I'm so glad you're okay," she mumbled into my ear and rested her head against my shoulder. "About that, they didn't find anything?" Lucy asked. The surprise of finding out she had a second sibling was apparently nothing compared to the emotional shock of seeing Liz, Lauren, and myself again. To her it felt like we had come back from the dead, and when we told her about our search for her missing sibling, she was even happier. We had expected our daughters to hate us when we eventually told them about their missing brother or sister, but they gave us such positive reactions. Lucy wanted another little sister to look after, or a little brother that she could find the perfect girlfriend for. Lauren just wanted a sibling that was her age, so she wouldn't feel like the youngest in the family anymore, even though she and her missing sibling had been born on the same day. They spent 6 months investigating and found no evidence. "The kidnappers had long vanished with your brother," Liz said. When Liz told us that she thought the golden blonde-haired girl that looked like Lauren was our missing child, we were all confused. We had been led to believe that our missing child was a boy, but what we found was a girl that looked almost exactly like Lauren. "And you think that girl upstairs is our brother?" Lucy asked, trading confused glances with Lauren. "Doesn't it make sense?" "He ran away from the house next door and hid here disguised as a girl so they wouldn't find him, and when Suzanne here took him to the council building, everyone thought he was Lauren," Liz said, and it was clear she had been thinking about that over and over in her head. Lauren shifted nervously in her seat when realized someone was posing as her. I caught Suzanne clenching her fist when Liz referred to fake Lauren as a boy, but she remained calm and silent as she watched and listened from the opposite side of the couch that we had all gathered on. "But Mom, you haven't spent more than a couple of minutes around her. She's too small and slim to be a boy, her legs are shaved and she wears panties and a training bra. I doubt a boy would do all that just to hide for a few days," Lucy said. "I guess you're right, Lucy, honey, but all the neighbors thought she was a boy. If the girl upstairs is our missing daughter, then she has spent the last 10 years of her life, since before she can probably remember, dressing and thinking like a boy," Liz said, sniffling. "What does the other girl have to do with all this?" I asked Suzanne. "My daughter Kirsty? She and the girl have been best friends ever since Kirsty supposedly found her in a park several weeks ago. They made up a story about the girl being an orphan called Lauren, and I was led to believe it," Suzanne said, calmer now that our missing child was thought to be a girl and not a boy. The couple next door said that a child who they thought was a blonde-haired boy spent a lot of his time playing with the girls. That was our missing daughter. She and Kirsty must have been close friends. When our daughter decided to run away, she must have come to Kirsty for help, who hid our daughter's male clothes and dressed her up in your. Liz looked at Suzanne, as if she was forgetting something. "Haley, my youngest," Suzanne said. "Yes, Kirsty must have dressed our daughter in Haley's clothes," Liz finished. "So our sister thinks she's a boy?" Lauren asked. "Her kidnappers have made her think that, yes dear," Liz said. "Why would they make her think she was a boy?" Lauren asked. "I don't think they wanted a girl in the first place, Lori," I said, giving my youngest a gentle smile. "They must have rushed into the hospital and kidnapped what they thought was a boy, but when they realized they'd taken our daughter, your sister, it was too late for them to go back," I said. I could see each of us had upset looks on our faces. Each of us were probably thinking about how our daughter, Lauren and Lucy's sister, and how she had to pretend to be something she wasn't for 10 years. I thought more about the man who pretended to be my daughter's dad for 12 years, the man who had taken the job that I was supposed to have. "So you all agree that the girl upstairs is your daughter?" Suzanne asked Liz, and I traded glances and nodded. "The letter led us to that house next door," I said. "And our daughter was seen living there," Liz said. "We know it's her, she is our sister," Lucy said and smiled at Lauren. "I'll call for her and Kirsty then," Suzanne smiled and got out of her seat, heading towards the door. "Wait!" Lucy suddenly blurted out, making us all jump. What do we call her? Lucy asked. In the whole of our conversation we had never thought to ask about our missing daughter's name. She responds to Lauren, Suzanne said. No, not Lauren. Lauren is a bad name. Lucy declared. Hey! Lauren shouted, and gave Lucy an enraged look. I don't mean it like that. Lucy said hurriedly, I mean we can't have two sisters called Lauren, nobody does that, Lucy finished. Each of us was nodding in agreement whilst Lauren calmed herself down. What about the name she went by when she lived here? Suzanne, do you know her male name? Liz asked. I think Kirsty often talked about a blonde-haired boy called Ian. That was the only boy's name I remember her saying when she talked about her friends from the cul-de-sac, Suzanne said. We'll call her Ian, Liz decided. But Mom, it's weird if you give a girl a boy's name, Lauren said petulantly. I know it's weird, honey, but we have to make our daughter feel comfortable. Remember that she doesn't know we're her real family, not yet, Liz said, putting her arm around Lauren's shoulders. I've known her for longer than any of you, but I still feel like I'm about to meet her for the first time, Lucy said, shaking with visible excitement that I could feel with her arms still around mine. Don't all jump on her at once, we don't want to scare her away, I said jokingly. Suzanne nodded and shouted up the stairs. Kirsty, Lauren. Can you come downstairs please? Are we going to change her name? Lucy asked. We will soon enough, Liz said. To what? Lauren asked. I still have the list of baby names that your father and I came up with 12 years ago. We'll have a look, Liz said and gave me a joyful smile. She had kept that list of baby names as a reminder of our lost daughter, and now she could finally look at it again and feel happy, not sad. Ian, I tentatively stepped into the lounge, where the chairs had been arranged just like they had been at the garden party weeks earlier. The real Lauren, effectively my twin if you were to ignore the shape of her face, was sitting on the left side of the couch, huddled closely with her mother. The mother had dark blonde hair that looked like glowing caramel flowing down around her shoulders and to her nipples. Her chocolate brown eyes watched me closely as I sat down. Beside the mother, Lucy sat, perched on the armrest of the couch. Sitting next to Lucy was a tall, strongly built man in his late 30s. He had dark blue eyes like Lucy and Lauren, as well as me, but his hair was dark brown, only a couple of inches long and neatly combed. He sat on one of the wooden chairs from the kitchen, and Lucy had her arms tightly wrapped around his bicep. All four of them had huddled around the left side of the couch, meaning that when Suzanne, Kirsty and myself walked into the room, we were effectively split into two groups. Kirsty and I both sat down on two more wooden chairs from the kitchen that had been pointed towards the couch, whilst Suzanne remained standing. You two have some explaining to do. You're in on this as much as she is, Kirsty, Suzanne said accusingly as she looked between Kirsty and myself. I'll be in the kitchen, Suzanne said, and without waiting for a reply she disappeared into the corridor. Kirsty and I sat nervously. She was lightly tapping her fingers against her knees whilst I was crossing my feet and looking down at the floor. In a brief moment where I had the courage to look up, I watched curiously as all four of them nervously shifted in their seats as Suzanne left. There were a few moments of awkward silence, before the tall man glanced at the Dawsons' mother and must have decided enough is enough and broke the silence. First of all, he said in a calming voice, not the furious one I was expecting. I just want to clearly say that neither of you are in any trouble. My wife and I just want to hear your side of the story. Kirsty and I let out an enormous sigh of relief upon learning that we weren't in trouble, but if they didn't want to punish us, what did they want? Our side of the story? I asked. Well, we know you're not really an orphan found in the park, and we know you used to live just next door, the man who I now guessed was Lucy and Lauren's dad said. Wait, if they knew I lived next door, then they knew who I was. I'm so sorry. I blurted out. This is all big mistake," I continued as the Dawson family froze in their seats. "We were just playing around." Kirsty butted in. "I chased Ian into my house and then that's where everything got worse. Kirsty isn't allowed boys in her room, so when her mom came home she disguised me as a girl so we wouldn't get into trouble." I continued on from Kirsty. Both our voices had become louder, nervous and frantic. "We tried to escape but every time we failed, and then when Ian's parents moved away he didn't have anywhere to escape to," Kirsty said. "So I got stuck here and then Kirsty's mom took me to the town center where everybody gave me all these weird looks, and they showed me a picture of Lauren that looked exactly like me. I didn't know what to do or say to prove it wasn't me, so I trailed off as suddenly the dark blonde-haired woman, Mrs. Dawson, stood up from the couch and rushed towards me. She had sat and waited patiently whilst her husband spoke, but I could tell she was struggling to contain something within her when she saw me, when she heard me speak. Whatever it was had built up inside her as Kirsty and I desperately tried to explain ourselves, and now it had finally burst. Lucy and Lauren almost fell off the couch after their mother had suddenly moved, but they had moved to their feet anyway and were standing just behind their mother. Mrs. Dawson sat down on her knees right in front of my chair and placed her soft hands on my legs. "It's okay, honey, relax. You don't have to explain," she said in a calm, soothing voice. "We know that you've been living here for as long as you can remember, but you haven't always lived here," she continued. What was she talking about? And why was she acting like that? I had got used to Suzanne calling me sweetheart and dear, but this woman was still a total stranger to me and was already touching my knees and calling me honey. "What does that have to do with anything?" I asked. "You said your parents moved away without you. Didn't you wonder how they found it so easy to leave you?" Mrs. Dawson asked, tears welling up in her eyes. "They didn't recognize me when we came face to face," I stuttered out, reminding myself of the heartbreaking feeling I had when my mom and dad looked me straight in the eye and still didn't know who I was. "Well, your face was painted," Kirsty reminded me. "I know, but still." "I was right there in front of them," I told her. "Exactly, sweetheart, Ian, don't you see? You may think your parents abandoned you, but they haven't, they're right here in front of you," Mrs. Dawson said, giving me a pleading smile. I struggled for a moment to realize what she was saying, then looked around the room at everyone. Suzanne had casually snuck into the lounge and was standing to the right of Mr. Dawson, watching with intrigue. I looked at Kirsty and she was giving me a beaming smile, as if the woman in front of me on her knees was really my mother. I looked at Lauren, saw her standing there with her hands gathered together as if she was praying, waiting for me to say something. Her face was staring right at me, trying to make me realize exactly why we looked so similar, and that it wasn't just a mere coincidence. "Is she what?" I struggled to put any sentences together. My mind had already decided for me that what Mrs. Dawson was my mother, Lauren and Lucy my sisters, and Mr. Dawson was my father, but for some reason my body and my mouth still didn't think that. Was my mind trying to trick me? Was it just desperate to believe something that seemed too good to be true? Maybe it was this new body of mine, making me think differently. I couldn't be sure of what else that dress had done to me. 12 years ago, when you and your sister were born, you were taken away from us by the people who called themselves your parents. We searched and searched for months, but you had already vanished. Ever since that time, there has been a hole in our hearts where you should have been, but you're here now. We found you and we're never going to abandon you," Mrs. Dawson said, and then lurched forward and wrapped her arms around my neck. I didn't know what to say or do. I just froze up on the spot like I always seemed to do when I was clueless. I could tell I was crying, tears were falling in a steady rhythm down my cheeks. I guess I just kind of fell into her arms and started crying, just like on my first night as Lauren when Suzanne hugged the life out of me. There, it's all right, sweetheart. "Mummy's here, Mrs. Dawson," or Mum whispered in my ear. "You won't have to pretend to be a boy anymore, I promise," Mum said. "Wait, what? Marcus, is she asleep?" I asked Liz as she sat on the couch with Laura's head resting in her lap. I was struggling to get used to calling her Ian, so I decided to call her Laura instead when I thought about her, or when she was asleep. "She is," Liz said quietly and smiled contentedly. I sat down on the couch as silently as possible, careful not to wake Laura, and slid my arm behind Liz, across the back of the couch. "Did you believe her story?" Liz whispered. "I believe the one where she was raised as a boy, but not the one about the magical dress that gave her a girl's body," I said. Laura had tried to explain that she really was a boy until she put on a dress, which had apparently given her breasts and taken away her penis. We may have nodded along slowly to make her feel better, but I don't think any of us could really believe her. Lauren and Lucy decided that their sister had been brainwashed by her kidnappers into thinking a girl's body was the same as a boy's, and that we would have to unbrainwash her. I checked under her top, Liz said as she stroked some of Laura's golden blonde locks. "Just in case there was any truth to her story. She's 100% female, in the middle of puberty, I think." "Where do you think she came up with the magic dress story?" I asked. "I don't know, honey," Liz looked at me worriedly. "Maybe it was a reaction to wearing such feminine clothes after she had spent all of her life in boys' clothes?" I shrugged. "Should she see a doctor?" I asked. "No, it's not that bad. We just have to convince her that she's a girl, and then maybe she'll grow out of it," Liz sniffled. "Marcus, whenever I think about how those people raised our daughter, made her think like this, I just want to." Liz clenched her fists and shook her head. "Honey bunny, I know you're angry with them, I'm angry with them too, but remember what we said. This wasn't about revenge, it was about our child, and now we have her back, forget about those people," I said. I gave her a gentle tickle at the back of her neck to ease her fury, a strategy that I had perfected years ago, pet names and tickles. We sat quietly together and watched the news on a low volume as Laura slept silently on Liz's lap. Several minutes of news watching later, Liz began her nightly checkup. Every day there were many things that she would task herself with doing, as well as things she would ask me to do, and she would then check if everything had been done at the end of the day. "Where are the girls sleeping?" Liz asked. "Upstairs in Lucy's room, Lauren brought her sleeping bag inside," I said. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll sleep in the van," I said. Liz pouted and declared, "No, I'm not having you sleeping in that uncomfortable van whilst we're all inside a warm house. The only spare bed is in that little girl's room upstairs," I said. "Isn't that good enough for you?" Liz asked, smirking. "I'll sleep where you and Ian sleep," I said. "Well, we're not moving anytime soon. Think you can fall asleep where you're sitting?" Liz asked and looked at the limited room I had on the end of the couch. "I've slept in smaller spaces," I grinned, thinking of the van we had been living in for 3 or 4 weeks. We continued watching the news for a few minutes before Liz remembered more things she needed to check on. "Did you phone your work in London?" she asked. "They weren't the only ones I phoned. I contacted the lawyers, social services, the police, so they would make everything official. They had to alter all of her records so that they showed her as a girl, since the kidnappers had registered her as their own son. She's missed 1 year of schooling because she wasn't registered to any school last year, but they say she can start in year 8 and skip year 7 if she takes a few written tests." I summarized what I had done for the last few hours since Laura had fallen asleep in Liz's arms. "And I phoned the school that Lucy is now registered to. They say that Lauren is the one that's registered to go in September. She just has to get her own uniform, her picture taken, and has to sit through an interview." Ian has to go through the whole process again, but they'll make it extra quick and simple. They say because of the situation, we'll be given extra time to get all our daughters registered and ready for school in September. I'm glad we both decided we wanted to move out of London, but where are we going to live now? It has to be close to the school, otherwise the girls would have wasted a ton of paperwork and time getting registered, Liz said. About that. When I was outside getting things from the van, an elderly man came up to me and said he lived in the house next to this one, hidden at the very end of the cul-de-sac. He said you'd come to his door and told him and his wife our story? I asked. I told them about the search for our daughter and that we thought she was nearby. Yeah, Liz said coolly. Well, he said he and his wife had a few spare rooms that we could stay in if we couldn't find a place to stay, and that if things worked out for us, we could move into the house when they moved out in a couple of weeks, I said. You're joking, aren't you? Liz asked. I had felt as surprised as she was when I said the words myself. I'm not. Graham and Margaret have several spare rooms, a large house, and they are planning on moving to the countryside within a couple of weeks. The house is effectively ours if we want it, I smiled happily. Both of us were being very cautious with our excited voices as we tried desperately not to wake Laura. This is perfect, honey. I knew we would struggle to bring Ian with us to London. She's lived here all her life and that would just be another shock to her life if she had to move, but now we won't have to. Liz had a relieved look on her face. What about Lucy and Lauren? I asked. They like it here like I do. They have a few friends back at Highgate, but they always said how much they hated living in the city. I think they'll be able to adjust to living here quickly, Liz said. We'll tell the girls our plans in the morning then, I said. What did the records office say about Ian's name? Liz asked. They expect us to change it to girl's name and are waiting for us to call them back with our decision, I said. I'll ask Ian about it tomorrow, but I do want to get her name changed. I can't go on calling her Ian for too long, it'll just keep reminding me of how those kidnappers manipulated and controlled our daughter's life. She needs a new name for her new life, Liz said as she pulled a folded piece of lined paper from her pocket. Remember when we struggled to pick a name from that list for Lauren? I asked with a smirk. I guess we'll have to go through all that again. It has to be perfect for her, Liz said. We huddled close and peered at the list for the first time in what seemed like years, the side with boys' names we ignored, and focused all our decision-making powers on the girls' names. At the top was Eleanor, followed by Alex, Grace, Sophia, Michelle, Laura, Olivia, Brooke, Kimberly, Jane, Elaine and Maria. I think her middle name should be my younger sister's name, Liz suggested. Ashley? I asked. No, silly, Michelle. Ashley is my older sister, and that's Lauren's middle name. Why don't we start with her first name instead? I suggested. Well, you know that I've always loved Eleanor, Liz said. That was why Eleanor was at the top of the list. You don't want another name beginning with L? Like Louise? I asked. Ian definitely isn't a Louise, and she looks too much like Lauren, so we can't give them similar names. But with Eleanor, we could call her Ellie or Elle, aren't those sweet nicknames? Liz asked, nodding her head in reply to her own question. Lucy, Lauren and Ellie, they go well together, I said. So you like Eleanor? Liz asked. I think I like Eleanor as much as you do, darling, I said, smirking. So Eleanor Michelle, that's what we're going with? I'll tell Ian in the morning, Liz declared. No, hang on. We didn't agree on the middle name. What about the other girls in the family? I asked. I had always felt like Liz had only thought of her two sisters when we named our children. Well, why don't you choose, dear? Liz smiled, thinking I wasn't up to the task. Faye, my mother's name, I said proudly. Liz looked surprised. Eleanor Faye Dawson, I love it, Liz said with a delighted smile. Ellie Dawson, she'll be the most popular girl in school with a name like that. Ian, I woke up the next morning, with a thick woolen cover pulled over me. I was surprised to see that I had slept in the lounge, which was welcome sight to wake up to after I had been waking up in a little girl's princess room for the past few weeks. I pushed myself up into a sitting position and quickly realized that I had been sleeping in the arms of the dark blonde-haired woman from last night. No, she was my mom, wasn't she? My real mom. My mind was feeling very hazy, but I knew that last night these two people came to Suzanne's house and told me this long complicated story. The point of it was that they were my parents, that Lucy and Lauren were my sisters. I know, yes, I remember now. I tried to convince Mom that I was a boy, but she just kept saying that I wasn't, that the mean people who had kidnapped me had just made me think I was a boy. Mom had confused me, constantly saying that I had been born a girl but raised as a boy. I guess she never really believed the magic dress story that I had told her, and why would she? I struggled to believe it myself until Kirsty put the dress on me, and now how could I prove its magical effects? If I put it on again, it wouldn't take anything away or change my body in any way, and that wouldn't get me anywhere closer to Mom believing me. Mom remained asleep as slowly pushed myself off the couch, my legs shivering since I was still wearing the denim shorts from last night. For once I actually missed my pink Minnie Mouse pajamas. I walked into the kitchen, where Dad was standing in the same clothes he wore last night, with a steaming cup of tea in his hand. Oh! Good morning, Ian, he said as soon as he saw me, and then put his tea down and rushed to pour a glass of orange juice. Morning, Dad, I said just as a huge yawn escaped my mouth. Have you recovered from last night? Dad smiled at me as I sat down at the table. I think so. I know you're my mom and dad, I guess it was just hard for me to stop thinking of them as my parents. But now I can't believe I actually thought they were my parents, I said. I wonder if that was why I had started crying last night. I shared no similarities with my fake parents, but these people had obviously combined each of their features and created me. I felt incredibly stupid for thinking that my kidnappers were even related to me. Why didn't I escape sooner? I thought to myself. Did they treat you well? Dad asked. Well, they fed me, but ignored me most of the time, I said. I spent most days playing outside with Kirsty. Dad sat down opposite me on the other side of the table, his hands clenched into fists after he handed me the glass of orange juice. You can forget about them. You're going to learn what it's like to have real parents now, Dad said. I looked at him suspiciously as I sipped some orange juice. Don't worry, Ian, we won't rush you, he said. Dad, why do you still call me Ian if you think I'm a girl? I asked. Sweetheart, we don't think you're a girl, we know you're a girl, Dad said. How could I prove him wrong? Last night Kirsty had phoned the store owner of Meg's Prosthetic Fashions to find out whether the changes could be reversed. But each of the 3 times she called, there was nobody there to answer the phone. For now I was stuck with a girl's body, and I had nothing to prove that I used to be a boy. However, the more I thought about it, the more I started to ignore the fact that I wasn't a boy anymore. I paid more attention to this new life I had ahead of me with my real, loving family. If I was destined to be stuck in a girl's body for the rest of my life, then fine, I can deal with that. But at least I wasn't pretending to be a girl and taking over someone's life. This time, I was a real person with a real life of my own, albeit a female one.